You ever wonder about the little details in the scriptures? If you're somebody who likes the details like I do, then you're really going to enjoy this next episode. Well, welcome back to the show, and I am excited today because we are here in the north in the Golan with Dr. Garth Gilmour. Dr. Garth, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Jeff.
It is great to be here, and we're at a site that you are particularly excited about. I am too, because I've never been here before, but tell us where we are and what we're going to learn today.
We're on the site of Tel Hazor up in the north of Israel. It's the biggest archaeological site in the country, 200 acres. It just extends over the hills and far away behind us.
Wow.
And it's a significant biblical site. But not only is it a biblical site, it's also fantastic archaeologically. It has massive monumental architecture from the Canaanite period, from the Israelite period. It's full of history, it's full of biblical significance, and it's just the most wonderful site. And it's one of the great undiscovered gems of Israel's tourism, archaeological tourism trail, because very few people actually come here. So I'm delighted to have this opportunity to give it some publicity today.
Well, I had never been, and so I understand why that is the case, but we're going to learn today why it should be on our list of places to visit, and it should be on your list of places to visit. You said that it's Canaanite era, it goes back all that way. What's the dating?
Well, there are 21 different levels here. Yigal Yadin dug here in the 1950s, from 1956 to 1959, and in more recent years, since 2000, Amnon Bentor, also of the Hebrew University, one of Yadin's students actually, has been back here and excavating subsequently. And they found 21 different levels of cities, one on top of another beneath us, starting about 2700 BC, in the first great phase of urbanism in this region. This city was occupied, or this site was occupied, because it's on a low hill overlooking a critical road from Egypt to Mesopotamia. In fact, the road that we drive on to get here now is the old British road from the Mandate period, which went from Cairo to Damascus. And there's a water source just nearby where there's not a spring, but there's a high water table because of the geology under the ground. And so this has got everything it needs to be a critically important place, politically, geographically, and biblically. And in the second millennium BC, after a period of decline and abandonment, all of a sudden new people come into the land from the north, bring in a new material culture, and they are really the people who found what we know to be the great Canaanite city-states, of which this was the greatest. No doubt about it, this was the head of all those kingdoms, which is what the book of Joshua describes Hazor as.
Phenomenal.
Coming up, Jeff and Dr. Gilmour explore the ancient gate of Tel Hazor. First Century Foundations is continuing to bless the land of Israel. And this is all possible because of people like you. With your help, we have been able to support local ministries within Israel who are caring for some of the nation's most needy by providing food and clothing for the poor, and much more. The House of Light is one such ministry that not only ministers in prisons, but also runs a summer camp for children.
We're in the middle of this camp, and all the noise of the children around us, rejoicing in the Lord and in your help, and we just want to say thank you.
This is all possible because of your prayers and support. Call or write today and become a monthly partner for just $30 a month or more. And be sure to ask for your free Israel Prayer Watch so you can be up to date on all that is happening with these ministries in the Holy Land. We are waiting to hear from you.
Now, you wanted to start here because of a viewpoint that we have out this way. Tell us what it is you're going to explain here about where we're standing.
Well, the site has two main areas, the upper Tel and the lower Tel. And the upper Tel, which we're standing on, has had all 21 of those levels represented. But the lower Tel, which disappears off into the distance, the green fields behind us, is limited just to the 2nd millennium BC, just to the period of the great Canaanite city-states. And when Yadin came and excavated here, there were a number of different reasons for that. But one of them was to try and find out what the lower Tel was for. Why was there this massive lower Tel? Did it have a particular function? Did it have a particular purpose which remains hidden? We knew from earlier excavations that there were buildings up on this upper Tel. And one of the more exotic, fanciful ideas about the lower Tel, which I really enjoy, was that somebody had suggested that maybe it was a car park for chariots. And so they decided to excavate and see what was there. What they discovered, in fact, was that it was part of the city, that people lived there. And at its height, in the 2nd millennium BC, this was not just the biggest city in the country, but the most important city in the country. There were perhaps up to 30,000 people living at this one site. And
wow.
in an era of, compared to today, very low population.
Right.
That's dramatic, that's huge. This was a major center, a major regional center in the whole ancient Near East.
Now, Garth, another question. You referenced earlier when we were chatting this platform down below. Tell us a little bit about the significance of what we're looking at here.
Well, this platform is particularly interesting. I mentioned that the lower Tel was occupied during the 2nd millennium BC, during the Canaanite period.
Right.
And up here was the elite area. This was where the palace was, the administrative center, where everybody went to work. And somehow you had to get from one to the other. The other thing is not just the people coming to work in the morning up on the main area from down below, but also visitors. And most visitors would have come from the north, most important visitors, most trading delegations, visiting kings and so on, because the city gates were on this side. And so people would come in, and this is where they would enter through this area to get up onto the main part of the mound of the city. And what we're going to do is spend the rest of the time looking at the remains that are on the mound, which are hugely impressive, not just from the Canaanite period, which is fantastic and very well preserved, but also from the time of King Solomon and King Ahab.
Wonderful. Lead the way. Well, Garth, one of the exciting things for me about coming to Israel and seeing all of these sites is to be able to make, the biblical connection for our viewers back home. And we talked about the lower Canaanite site. Now you're going to explain to us how this ties into the scripture, how the Israelite kingdom is connected here. So what are we standing in front of here right now?
Well, this is the city gate from the Solomonic period. And just to put it into context, that lower city, that Canaanite city, both lower and upper, was destroyed by fire in a dramatic citywide conflagration by some antagonistic group sometime in the 13th century BC. So at the end of the Canaanite period, people attacked this city and burnt it to the ground. And there's dramatic evidence of that fire, which we'll see in a minute. But what happened then was the city was abandoned. And for the whole of the period of the Judges, for nearly 200 years, nobody lived here. There was a small squatter settlement, a very minor settlement of people for a short period. But other than that, the site was really completely abandoned. And we read about that in the book of Joshua, chapter 11 and 12, where Hazor is described as the head of a coalition of northern kings that gathers together to oppose the incoming Israelites. And of course, they lose. And it's very interesting that the author of that passage, and there's a lot of issues, I know, with the biblical account of the conquest, but in this particular passage, it's interesting that the author makes the point of stressing that of all of those cities, it was Hazor that was put to fire. That it was Hazor that was burned down. And of all those kings, it was the king of Hazor who was put to the sword.
Right.
None of the others are mentioned specifically. And that shares with us both the importance of this site as the head of all those kingdoms, and also it testifies to the archaeological record that we found. A similar story, or another version of that story, is found in Judges chapter 4, of course, which is the story of Jabin, king of Hazor, and his general Sisera, who was caught in an ambush by Deborah, and Sisera escapes while all his soldiers are being killed, and he runs up into the heights of Naphtali behind us, where he meets, unfortunately for him, Yael, the Kenite woman, and she puts a tent peg through his temple as he's sleeping. Not a very nice story, but that's another version of the story of the conquest of Hazor, and that story too ends up with the city being completely destroyed.
And if I'm not mistaken, the reference in Scripture actually uses that phrase, the head of the northern kingdoms.
Or the head of all those kingdoms.
The head of all those kingdoms.
Yes, yes.
So there's a connection that we make here. And you know, you mentioned some trouble with the accounts of the conquest and so on, but somebody mentioned this place with enough specificity that what has been found here really does support
testify to that. I think the thing is, look, there was a very deliberate effort to not only destroy the city, but to humiliate the gods of this city. So we're talking about a new ethnicity coming in. Now, who could it have been? There's two main candidates. One is that there was an internal revolt by the people of the city who were being oppressed by the authorities here. And while that's a possibility, it's unlikely. Far more likely is that it was a new incoming group that sought to overthrow the power of the city.
Right.
And there's only one candidate for that, and that's the Israelites. And in the absence of any other candidates from ancient literature of the time, I'm happy to say it was the Israelites.
Yeah. Yeah, a group that worshiped the one true God.
That's right.
That was against anything that had to do with idolatry.
Yes, the site stood empty for 200 years.
Right.
And then all of a sudden, this massive monumental architecture is imposed on the site during the reign of King Solomon. And so what has happened in the meantime? At the end of the period of Judges, we know that Saul becomes king, and there's very little evidence, there's some, but very little evidence for the reign of Saul. And then David takes over from Saul, and David is a warrior. He goes out and conquers people.
Right.
He extends the borders of his kingdom. But he doesn't build very much. The building is left up to Solomon. He's the consolidator. He's the chap that consolidates the kingdom by building monumental architecture. And in archaeology, how do we identify the rise of a state, the rise of a monarchy? It's through the appearance of monumental architecture. When there is no king, when everybody's doing what is right in their own eyes, there's no need for monumental architecture. Everybody's just trying to get by.
Right.
They're trying to grow enough food to feed their families. But all of a sudden, we get this.
So we know that Solomon built this. How do we know that?
Well, this is controversial. For years, scholars accepted that this level and the pottery that goes with this level dated to the 10th century BC, which is the time of the united monarchy of David, and particularly Solomon.
Right.
In the last 20 or 30 years, there have been some scholars that have suggested that actually David and Solomon never existed, that
Right.
Solomon or David, in the words of Philip Davies of the University of Sheffield, is about as historic as King Arthur, and that all of the stories of the united monarchy, and in fact of the whole kingdom of Israel and Judah, are made up stories from hundreds of years later. They're just propaganda. Well, this is really not sustainable from the archaeological record. More credible is a sort of middle theory, which suggests that the stuff that we all thought dated to the 10th century and to the united monarchy of Solomon actually dates to 100 years later, to the time of Omri and Ahab. Why? Because Omri and Ahab are mentioned in Assyrian records, whereas David and Solomon are not. There's many reasons, there's many other reasons for this theory, but let me say this, that after 20 or 30 years of debate, serious debate on this issue, the two sides are no closer than they were before, and the majority still supports the traditional viewpoint, including the excavators of this site, that this is dated to the Solomonic period, that these walls and this gate date to Solomon.
Now, I know you're going to show us a little bit inside.
That's right.
But last question, and the question is this. Solomon is in Jerusalem. He's
right.
way away from here.
Right.
Why would he come all the way up to the north and build this monumental architecture?
Very good question. Why did Solomon take the time and the trouble and the effort and the money
Right.
to build this monumental structure here? So we know that there were truculent, disobedient, if you like, tribes who were reluctant to be absorbed into the kingdom that was based in the south. And what Solomon is doing is saying to these people, don't mess with me. I'm not a soft touch. I may be hundreds of miles to the south in Jerusalem, but this is what I can do. I can build these massive structures. I can have a military fortress here at Hazor, where for 200 years there was nothing. Don't mess with me. I'm much more powerful than you realize.
Wow, great answer. Well, show me.
Yeah, let's go inside.
See what's here.
Up next, Jeff and Dr. Gilmour continue to explore Tel Hazor. First Century Foundations is committed to helping those in need in the land of Israel. And this is possible because of people like you. Your donations are helping the Jerusalem Institute of Justice, who provide for some of the most vulnerable in the land. One such group are the aging Holocaust survivors, spending time through activities and caring for their needs for food and medication. The Jerusalem Institute of Justice and First Century Foundations are making a real difference in the lives of people who have experienced so much.
People like us who lost everything and live with the pain, to have people that help us a little bit, we're very grateful.
Call or write today and receive the free Israel Prayer Watch to keep up to date with all that is happening with these ministries in Israel, and become a partner for just $30 a month or more. Your gifts make a difference. Call today.
So what can we see here? What are we looking at?
Well, this is the Solomonic Gate. It's a massive structure. It's over 350 square meters in size, which is larger than most three-bedroom suburban single-story homes. It's really monumental in size. And it consists of a very specific design. It has 6 chambers, 3 on each side, and 2 huge towers in the front guarding the entrance. And this is the classic Solomonic Gate. I mentioned earlier that the Bible talks about Hazor, Megiddo, and Gezer being built up by Solomon.
Yes.
And it's this gate design that we find at each of those 3 sites.
Okay.
So it's interesting that some people have the chutzpah, if you like, to suggest that the biblical record was written hundreds of years later by people who didn't know what they were talking about. If that's the case, it's amazing how much they got right.
Yes. Yeah,
but
that's right.
what can we see as well is the city wall. And the city wall abuts this gate on both sides. But it's an interesting city wall. It's what we call a casemate wall. You will remember when we went to Kibbutz Kayafa, there was a casemate wall there as well. It's a double wall, creating a space in between the 2 walls, which is divided up by small cross walls. And the advantage of that is, firstly, it creates rooms in the wall that can be used either as the back rooms of houses or as storerooms, but also it creates a very wide wall for soldiers to walk along. And it gives the impression for people outside of it being much bigger and more powerful than it is. So people walking past would see soldiers marching up and down on the platform, looking through the crenellations with a lot of depth. And it is imposing, it is significant, it is massive, and it gives this impression of power.
So it was a very intentional optical illusion.
That's right.
Made for people to believe that the wall was much thicker than it actually was.
Absolutely. And also,
cool.
It's a way for a king to say, this is my power. It gives bragging rights, if you like. This is how powerful I am. This is how big my city is. This is how big my city wall is. Now, this wasn't a big city. It only covered half the area of the top of the Tel. But it was powerful. And it probably was centered around a military barracks type city. that we have here during the time of
Fantastic.
Solomon. And then during the time of Ahab, of course, when the kingdom of Israel is established, the northern kingdom, it is expanded. And this gate really sits right in the middle of town. Whether it went out of use or not is another question. But the city expands across to cover the whole of this upper tell, and a new city wall. It's not a casemate wall, but an offset inset wall is established, which encircles the whole of the upper tell.
Great. What next? There's so much here to see.
There's so much here to see. We're going to go through the gate and
Okay.
back into the Canaanite period.
Back to the Canaanite
Back
period.
into the
Okay.
Canaanite period.
All right. Time warp. Let's go. Okay, so here we go.
We're entering this magnificent administrative building or palace
Right.
that was the dominant building of the Canaanites during the Canaanite period, the end of the Canaanite period. And before we go in, there's just a couple of interesting things that I'd like to show you.
Yeah,
For
okay.
example, you can see that this wall has been partially reconstructed by the restorers,
Right.
with wood and so on. But the bricks are the original bricks. And the fire which destroyed this structure was so hot that the clay from the bricks actually melted. It was incredibly hot,
Wow.
something like 1300 degrees, we believe, and the clay melted to a ceramic. So this is very evident over here. The other thing is...
So you've got big chunks of it that are actually fused together.
That's right. That's right. And
Okay.
some of it is melted and collapsed into dust, and other parts of it have melted and turned into ceramic. The other thing that's interesting is this little platform here. You can see there's a basaltic stepped platform
Right.
just to the left of the main entrance to the building. And this is similar to what we saw down below, where there was a basaltic platform at the entrance to the upper city.
Right.
And at other sites in Israel during the Israelite period, we have a similar phenomenon where there is a platform for a throne at the entrance to the city, particularly at Tel Dan. So these are things that we know about from the scriptures. We know about these from ancient records. And here at this site, we have this platform, which would have been where the king would have sat to welcome his guests. And as he sits and looks out towards the east and the north, really the view here is spectacular. You're
Yes.
looking out over the Jordan Valley, across to the Golan Heights, where you can see the ancient extinct volcanoes. And on a clear day like today, you can see Mount Hermon brooding over Hazor
Yeah.
and the area that it governs. And of course, Hermon was seen partly by some of these people as a home of the gods. It was the highest mountain in the whole region.
Right.
And so it's really significant, the view that we see here and that the king has as he looks out towards his kingdom,
Spectacular.
welcoming
Spectacular.
his guests.
So-
And then we would go in.
The royalty back then were just as pretentious as much royalty.
They are, absolutely. Now we're coming into this building, and you can see on either side of the entrance there is a basalt slab with a depression
Okay.
carved in it. And these are the hinges for the main doors which would have shut this building at night or
okay.
when it wasn't in use. And you come into this magnificent hall. And this is what this is. This is a hall. This is an entertainment area.
Okay.
This is one of the reasons why one of the archaeologists who worked here said, this is not a palace. This is not a place where people lived. This is an entertainment center. This is an
okay.
administrative center. There are rooms behind on either side, which are too small, really, for a king with a big ego to live. And even though it would have had several stories, perhaps 3 or 4 stories, they would have modeled, the upper floors would have modeled the design of this ground floor. So this was probably a place where kings welcomed their guests, where they entertained their guests, where they did deals with trading groups that came
Right.
from other countries, and so on. And rather than a palace which may have been elsewhere on the site.
Thank you so much for bringing us here. And it's so exciting to me for us to understand the fact that, you know, where the scripture bears out the fact that Joshua came here and he burnt Hazor with fire.
That's right.
We can actually see the evidence of that here in this place. And I think that's incredible.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of First Century Foundations with Jeff Futers. This season is packed with amazing visits with people and places rarely shown on television. And now, for the first time, First Century Foundations is releasing extended cuts from the series with previously unseen footage. In this first DVD of extended cuts, you can now see Jeff's entire visit with Dr. Garth Gilmour to the ancient site of Tel Hazor. This incredible site sheds new light on the conquest of the Israelites as they entered the Promised Land under Joshua. You will also see the full edit of Jeff and desert tour guide Arthur Dumash as they explore the Negev desert and the abundant plant life that helps to further illustrate the biblical account of the Israelites and just how amazing God is. Call or write today to order your copy of this first Extended Cuts DVD for a gift of $20 or more plus shipping and handling. And be sure to keep watching First Century Foundations.
Well, I hope you enjoyed our visit to Tel Hazor today as much as I have. Dr. Gilmour is so knowledgeable when it comes to taking us through these sites and helping us to understand all of the significance of what we're seeing. Today we learned about the time period of King Solomon later on in the Israelite kingdom, and Solomon came and built that incredible gate there at the entrance to the ancient city. He did that for a couple of reasons. We learned that he did it because he wanted to send a clear message to surrounding enemies, but also to the people of Israel that Solomon was strong and he was mighty and he was ruling. He didn't want them to forget that he was way down in Jerusalem, and so he built this very imposing structure in the north. And then if we go back further in the history of the Israelite nation, we understand that Joshua and his armies, as they were coming into this area and making conquest there in the north part of the land, that they too were sending a clear message to the northern kings in that area. We learned about how the city was, without a doubt, burned with fire. Dr. Gilmour explained to us how that when they came, the archaeologists discovered in a very exciting way that the bricks that were there in the wall were actually melting and falling out of the wall because of the extreme heat of that fire. So why does God put those little details? Why did the writer put the detail about the fire into the scripture? He did it for you and he did it for me, so that as we read it, we would understand that it's not just a little side note, it's not just a tiny little detail that nobody cares about, but later on, when the archaeologists come and find that those walls were indeed burned with fire, then we can know that the story is not just a story, it's actually true. I hope that that was helpful for you today. I know that it's always exciting for us when we learn about the fact that the Bible really does say what happened in those days. I want to remind you that we support many ministries here in the land of Israel. We're able to help financially, we're able to pray and support those ministries, and we encourage you to continue to do the same. Thanks for tuning in today. God bless you. We'll see you next time on First Century Foundation.
Thank you for watching. To learn more about this program and the ministries in Israel that we help, or to receive the Israel Prayer Watch, call the number on the screen or visit us online at firstcenturyfoundations.com. And to keep up to date on all that we're doing, you can follow us on Facebook and Instagram. Join Jeff Futers again in Israel next week on First Century Foundations.